Hello, friends, and welcome again to another episode of Psychological Theatre. And today I would like to share some insights with you regarding a very crucial, a very important, and very dominant aspect of our life, and that aspect is our, some people call it natural, some people call it something, but our demand for pleasure. Now, I don't know if you have observed this or not in yourself, that as we live our lives, from morning to evening, there is always a strong demand for pleasure. Now, this demand can express itself in many ways. And if you understand the very nature of it, then you would see that the demand for pleasure is kind of active all the time in our life. From the morning when you wake up, or when anyone wakes up, there is always a choice, a preference for doing things. Everyone has their own preference of what kind of comfortable slippers they want to wear when they wake up, what kind of toothpaste you like when you brush your teeth, the taste that you like. Then the food that you eat, you have a preference in that as well, that I like this food. Then the kind of things you watch on your mobile phone, on your laptops, on your computers, what kind of videos you watch, what kind of things you do. Most of the things, if you would see, are directed towards a point of pleasure. Now, sometimes this pleasure is very subtle, and sometimes it's very obvious. For example, in food, it could become very obvious that you are going for pleasure. Okay? And by having a certain kind of taste that you like, and you want to feel the same again, and you go for the pleasure. And it could be subtle in the sense that the pleasure of getting a praise from someone, the pleasure of achieving something, the pleasure of feeling the sense of power over someone. So in all these senses, in all these aspects, pleasure dominates our life. It is not which is I say, or it is not what I feel. It's not my personal opinion. It's something you can easily observe. It's a living fact among all of us that we all demand pleasure every day in our lives. Okay? Now, if you would try to look at it closely, today I would not go on the mechanism of pleasure, like how pleasure arises and how it actually works. Today I'm just going a little bit on the aspect of why there is this demand of pleasure already. So the demand arises basically because of a very special factor. I don't know if you have observed that when you are like under great stress, okay, when you feel a lot of fear, or you are under depression, or things, or in situations like this, then you would see that it becomes really difficult for your brain to operate in its maximum capacity. when you don't want to give an exam tomorrow, but you have to, and you are under stress, then to prepare for that exam becomes really difficult. It's a very simple example. Or it could be more stronger, that if I put a gun on your head and ask you to solve something, and if you don't solve it, then you are dead. Then that stress affects the capacity of the brain. Okay? So when you're absolutely afraid, or when you're under a lot of stress, when you're under fear, then you would see that you kind of become useless. Useless in the sense that your capacity of solving problems goes down tremendously. And mostly in these kind of instances, when we are depressed, stressed, under fear, we tend to ask for help. We are asking helps from our religious leaders, that, hey, tell me what kind of things I can do or something. We are asking helps from the analysts, the psychiatrists, the psychoanalysts, or we are asking help from our friends, our family, which we trust more. So eventually you can see, if you would pay a little attention on it, that when the brain feels calm, when the brain feels secure, so as to say, it works really nicely. It solves problems really nicely. Which is why you would see usually people become very quiet when they are trying to solve a problem. They have to concentrate, focus, whatever you can say. So the brain demands that feeling of everything is fine in order to function perfectly. When the brain knows that it's completely secure and everything is fine, it works really nicely. There is no stress when you're sitting in your house trying to solve a problem, trying to write a book, a poetry, make a painting, a song, and you have no deadlines and nothing. It's a weekend, you have a nice cup of tea, and there is no stress on your brain, and you function beautifully at that instance, if you would see. So the brain kind of demands this feeling of niceness, this feeling of feeling secure, feeling calm, feeling relaxed, in order to function at its highest capacity. It's you don't have to take my words for granted. You can look at it on yourself. The day you're having really bad day with your friends, with your family, you are having a fight with your family member or something like this, you are under a lot of stress, and you would see how your brain naturally doesn't work as nicely as it would when you're in a more calm state, in a more feeling of security. Okay, so this observation, if you would do it for a week, for 2 weeks, you would see that the brain demands this security, this calmness, in order to function nicely, in order to express itself nicely. Now, life is totally unpredictable. Okay? A brain needs this feeling of security, but on the other hand, the brain observes that everything in life is moving in a flux. Nothing is constant, okay? So things are changing. Things are changing, so with this change, the brain doesn't feel that kind of calmness and that security, okay? The brain likes it when things are similar and they remain in that comfort zone. So the brain loves to live in its comfort zone, because when it's in its comfort zone, it feels secure. And when it's secure, it works really nicely. So, in order to do that, okay, when the brain observes that in the actual world, security is not available, because survival of the fittest, if you would see in the jungle, the animals are always attentive of their surroundings, and they're always like scared that, okay, something could happen any moment. Even in the human society, so as to say, things are quite stable, but you never know when a war would start. You never know when someone would break up with you. You never know when you would lose a family member. You never know when you would lose your job. So, when the brain observes all this, it becomes already scared of life. It becomes scared that life is very unpredictable, okay? Life doesn't offer that kind of security to it. And then the brain sees it that because it cannot work nicely if it's insecure, then it creates its own security. Please pay attention on this, that the brain creates its own security in order to feel secure. Okay? Now, the great masters, the great meditators have called it the trick of the brain. Okay, there are many terms used for it. But then the brain says, I would define myself what is secure, then I would do that thing and then feel that I'm secure. Okay? So how the brain does it is it clings to the memory of an experience. You had a beautiful ice cream, okay? Now the memory of that experience of having that ice cream remains with you, okay? Now the brain sees that when it is enjoying that ice cream, it forgets all its problems, okay? It forgets that it has a deadline. It forgets that there is problem at the house and this, okay? Now, it could forget it for a partial second, for half a second. If someone is totally lost in the ice cream, then even for minutes. So, the brain sees that every time it experiences pleasure, it feels secure. Okay? So, the brain starts defining pleasure on its own, on the basis of past experience. The brain starts putting pleasure almost at every stage of life. Then, because the brain sees that pleasure offers it this state of security, the brain tries to run for it. Now, pleasure and the feeling of happiness, these two things are separate. Or at least maybe in the future videos I would show it, that happiness is not the creation of your brain, you know, or joy, so as to say, is not created by you. It happens. But on the other hand, this pleasure is created by you. You have a contribution in feeling pleasure. I know you haven't felt it in your life. You usually think that this thing you are consuming, like an ice cream or anything, is giving you pleasure. But actually, when you would observe pleasure very closely, you would see that actually you yourself are also contributing a lot in the process of pleasure. So the brain sees that it requires this feeling of comfort, this feeling of calmness to function nicely. And hence, the brain starts living in a way in which it constantly feels pleasure, whether it could be a small pleasure or it could be a bigger pleasure. So, since morning to evening, every action you do, is based on that feeling of pleasure. You say it or you define it in the way that I'm doing it because I like it. But you don't see, when you say I like it, it actually means that my brain finds comfort in it. My brain feels secure while doing this action. And then you say, that's why I do it. So someone wakes up and starts making a nice breakfast because the brain is demanding the pleasure of food, because the brain may have lived with the strong pleasure of food in that person's case. Some people try to drown themselves in terms of entertainment, okay? From morning to evening, they are going through entertainment, because when they are in the state of entertainment, the brain feels secure because there is nothing to worry about. In the same way, some people are involving in other kind of pleasure, whether it's a sexual pleasure, whether it's a pleasure of some substance, whether it's a pleasure of some food, whether it's a pleasure of their own imagination, whether it's a pleasure of an experience. Okay? So all these kind of pleasures are demanded by the brain whole day. Okay? Now, the tragedy of it is that we have defined this pleasure-seeking mechanism as the essence of life, as the juice of life, okay? If I tell some person that, okay, you will not feel pleasure now for the next 1 week, then the person naturally asks, then what's the point of living? I'm living because I want to experience, this pleasure, I want to experience that, So, as a whole, a pleasurable experience has become the essence of life. Someone is finding it by jumping it from a plane, someone is finding it by climbing a mountain, someone is finding it on the bed in the night, having sexual intercourse, or someone is finding it in their imagination, okay? So, if you observe it in yourself every day, that how most of your actions are directed from a pleasure point of view, that how when you try to eat, you want to eat the food that gives you most pleasure. How when you start watching YouTube, you want to see the videos which give you more pleasure or more entertainment. And however, in any form you want to consume that pleasure, it's entertainment, it's pornography, it's anything. Okay? So when you look at it at yourself, then if you actually do it, you can see it even in a week. You don't need years or something like this. That in a week, a person can see that most of his life's action or her life's action are coming from this pleasure point of view, from the point of view of getting a satisfaction, from a point of view of experiencing something. And then the brain wants bigger and bigger experience, because the bigger the experience, the stronger the pleasure, and the more intensely the brain feels secure during that time. Okay? So, when you observe this cycle, you would see that the brain is intentionally doing this mechanism on its own. Okay? Now, till now, I haven't said that doing this is right or doing this is wrong, and we are not saying anything. We are not making a conclusion about this process. Okay, I think the first step is always to first observe it. Okay, that to first observe that the brain is constantly looking for pleasure. Then to observe what happens in the state of pleasure, that when you are experiencing pleasure, you feel nice, and that feeling nice means that the brain feels secure. And when the brain feels secure, it works nicely, and it wants to remain like that. But life is unpredictable. Life throws brain into situations which are unknown. So the brain has to go through different things. But while going through different things, it keeps sticking to the pleasure, because it has found a kind of comfort in this pleasure. Okay? So, when you want to experience pleasure again and again and again, there is nothing special about it, okay? Some people use the term, this is the desire of my soul, this is the desire of my spirit. That's absolute trash. I'm sorry for being harsh, but if there is something as the soul and the spirit, we are not saying it is or it is not. We are saying if there is, it wouldn't be of the same nature as the movement of desire, as the movement of pleasure. Okay? So, in that sense, if you live with your demand of pleasure, you would see how you have become a slave of it. You're not every time you feel the sense of freedom by choosing, when you say, I like it, that's why I do it, and that's why it's my freedom. Okay? But you would see that it's actually nothing, there isn't actually nothing special in your choice. It's just your brain trying to protect itself. It's just your brain trying to feel comfortable, because when it's not comfortable, it doesn't like to work nicely. Okay? So when you would observe that, first of all these confusions about the desire of the spirit and the soul, they will all wash away from you. You would see that it's an imaginative concept. That's fine, but essentially all pleasure is the movement which is driven by brain, and brain is a material. It's matter. Okay, so all your pleasures and your desires are not spiritual or some kind of soulful. They are all essentially materialistic processes. There is nothing super about your desire or your pleasure. Okay, your pleasure is also a movement in the brain, because the brain is feeling insecure all the time, because when it observes life, it sees it. The life is so insecure. Anything can happen anytime. So it wants to find some kind of security so that it can function nicely. Okay? Because if the brain is constantly under stress, it cannot work. It will start to deteriorate, or a constant situation of stress would lower its capacity to function in different areas. So the brain develops this cycle of pleasure. Now, because we don't observe the cycle of pleasure, we misname it or misconclude about it by saying it's the essence of life. Okay? Just because we don't understand pleasure, we say life is all about pleasure. Life is all about experience, bigger experience, more bigger experience, more bigger experience. Okay? Now, just because we don't see the true nature of pleasure, the true movement of it, how it arises, why it arises. Okay? So if you would see that, then slowly you would see all your actions are directed according to pleasure. Okay? And all that freedom you were feeling in your choice, that I am choosing, so I'm free, you would suddenly see that you are actually kind of the slave of your pleasure. Wherever there is pleasure, you go. So your life could also be predictive. Anyone who has observed you, who has seen what kind of pleasures you like, knows or can even predict what you would do tomorrow, because you would want to repeat the same pleasures the next day, because the brain has found security in it. So you realize that actually choice is not the indicator, the real indicator of freedom. That just because I can choose doesn't mean I'm free. Okay? I'm choosing according to my pleasure, according to my preference. So my preference and my pleasure becomes my master, so as to say. Okay? So observe it in your life. You would see that the brain works perfectly when it feels calm, relaxed, secure, and it's nice. Okay? Now, if that is not so, the brain will start creating its security by running behind pleasure. Okay? So from this you learn that either you provide the brain security, okay, or the brain would create its own security by running behind pleasure. Now, sadly, we do not know how to provide security to our brains, okay? Which is why most of the people are running behind pleasure and experience. Because there is no other way we know how to make the brain feel secure. So the brain eventually finds security in pleasure. And then it puts pleasure as the highest thing in life. Okay? But when you observe this, when you see that you have become the slave of pleasure, your whole life is nothing but a movement in pleasure, then you would start to become aware of it. Then it's not something that would pass you by and you wouldn't notice it, okay? Because then every time you're living like this, you would know you are not free in the actual sense, okay? Someone could say, I'm fine with this freedom of choice. That's a different matter. But if someone is actually, if someone is actually curious, someone is actually a lover of truth, someone is actually not trying to fool him or herself, then this person would observe that the movement of pleasure is not freedom. The movement of choice is not freedom. So this is only happening because my brain has no other way of finding security in any other way. The moment I find another way to give my brain some kind of security, then the brain naturally stops looking for security in pleasure. And this is what the great teachers and the masters, the Buddhas, have taught us, that provide security to the brain with meditation, not with pleasure. Because pleasure is an addictive process. It's just like taking a substance or just like any other thing. Because you want pleasure once, then the memory of that first pleasure demands the pleasure again. And then second time you want it even more. And then the third time and the fourth time, which is why you would see a person wanting initially the pleasure of going out of their small town. Then they want to go out from their whole district. Then they say, oh, I want to see the world. Then seeing the world becomes, okay, I want to jump from a plane. Then from that it becomes, I want to run a marathon, or any example. So the demand for experience and pleasure grows higher and higher and higher and higher. So it's just essentially the brain trying to create its own security. There is nothing supernatural in it. There is nothing spiritual in it, in pleasure and experience. Nothing like this. And of course, you don't have to take my words for it. When you actually observe it in your life every day for a week even, you would see it, that there is nothing like this in this. Because it's just a materialistic movement, a movement where something which exists in time is trying to protect itself, is trying to prevent its ending. I don't know if it's a little difficult for you, that anything which is in time, and time is a movement, okay? So the biggest fear for something that moves is to stop. If you want to make a change while something is moving and you say, okay, you can keep moving, but now you move with a different pattern or something like this, it's fine. And which is what people mostly do. They run from this meditation to that meditation to that meditation to this dresses and that dresses to this fashion to that fashion, and then they say I have changed. But essentially, the core never changes. Only the superficial pattern changes, because essentially they are still moving with this essence of time. Okay, we will discuss time maybe in more detail. It's a beautiful subject. So essentially people are moving with the time, and pleasure is time. I don't have this pleasure now, I want it in 2 minutes, in 10 minutes, by evening, by tomorrow, whatever it is. So you always have a point from where you are, and you have a point where you want to go when you have this experience or the pleasure. So try to see this in your life. Try to grasp it, that whether you want to live a life where the brain will find its own security in some kind of stupid things, okay? And I'm saying stupid because it's repetitive, okay? I'm not attacking pleasure in that sense, you have pleasure once in a while, it's fine. It's fine. But when pleasure becomes your drug, when pleasure becomes the highest principle in life, then there is disorder. Because then you're ready to fight for this pleasure. then you become very aggressive. You become very afraid. You're afraid, what if someone takes this pleasure from me? Because I find this with this pleasure I feel secure. So all kind of neurotic activities come into play. The fear, jealousy, aggression, violence, everything comes into the picture once you are constantly moving in this movement of pleasure. So try to see it. And of course, in the coming videos, I would like to go more deep in these things, and we would. So the deeper is only valuable when we've understood the first step, okay? So try to see how every action in your life is coming from a pleasure point of view, or most action in your lives are coming from a pleasure point of view. Then try to see why this happens, why is pleasure so important for you? Why you just want it all the time? Don't just say because I like it. That's not an answer. Then try to find what does it mean when you say I like it. Okay? Go into it, go a little deeper into it. And when you go really nicely into it, then you would see pleasure is not coming from somewhere. It's not the soul's demand or blah 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 that we say it is. It's just a movement inside the very matter of your brain. And that kind of helps you to get a more precise picture of yourself. Now you know that, okay, this is what I am. I'm not saying we are concluding whether what you are is good, bad. That's different. That comes maybe later. But first, can you live with your reality? Can you live with your truth? At the moment, you think pleasure is something else. At the moment, you think pleasure is something, the essence of life. It's the biggest thing in life and blah, 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 whatever you think about pleasure. But can you come to the very actuality of it and just live with that actuality, even for a week or a day? And you would see how limited you would feel. When all action is coming on the base of pleasure, eventually you would see that it doesn't feel free. Every time it's just the same pattern being repeated. So observe this, and when you observe this, something will happen. I don't have to tell you what will happen. If you have done it right, you will see it yourself. So do this, and if you have any questions about it, I would love to hear from you guys, and you can put it in the comments. And let's keep exposing this beautiful consciousness of ours from different point of views. So the exact movement of pleasure we will discuss in the coming videos, and at the moment, first see. Don't imagine. Don't try to think about it to understand it. See it actually in your life when you are doing actions. See how you decide to do action. And when you do that, you would see that most of your actions are decided on the basis of pleasure. So, with this, I would like to conclude today's video. And if you have listened with attention, then thanks a lot. And if you haven't, then I would request that please take your life a little seriously and try to listen and try to see these things. It's your life. Thank you.